Hi, I'm Chad with Move for a Guitar. This lesson is from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to explain how to look at modes in parallel. First off, if you'd like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this e-guide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. This is part 5.3 from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So in the last lesson, I talked about modes in series, and I explained how that was just taking one major scale, for example, the key of C, and then building your modes out of that C major scale. So every mode had the exact same notes as the C major scale, which is a parent major scale. This lesson we're going to look at building modes in parallel, which if you remember when I talked about parallel minor and parallel major, you can probably figure out what that means. It means that each mode is going to have the same root. So they're not going to have the same notes anymore, they're going to have the same root. For example, if I was in the key of C and we were building a C major scale, that's C Ionian, if I was going to build the second mode, which is Dorian, I'd build a C Dorian. But in the key of C, if I was building it in series, that'd be a D Dorian. And I'll explain as I'm going through this lesson to make it really clear. And looking at how to build modes in parallel is really important for really understanding what's going on and what the differences are between the modes. When you build them out of one parent major scale, it can get kind of confusing because you wonder, well, what's the point if they all have the same notes? It is still important, and I'll get more into that as we go through these lessons, but when you look at it with the same root, different notes, it's going to really help you understand what's going on with the intervals and how all these modes are different from each other. And also when you're soloing, modes are used for soloing. If you were to look at one chord, for example, if you just had a D minor 7 chord and there were no other chords around it, it was just one chord looping and you wanted to solo over it, knowing your different modes will give you different options for different scales you can play over it. For example, you could play a Dorian mode over it, a Phrygian mode over it, or an Aeolian mode over it. And we'll get into that more as we go through these lessons. If that's confusing, don't worry about it. But it is important for multiple reasons to be able to look at modes in parallel, not just all coming out of the same key, all having the same parent major scale. It's important to be able to look at them all with the same root so you can really tell the differences of what's going on with the intervals. And also, like I mentioned, if you were to take a C major scale, if you were to play from C to C, that's the Ionian mode. If you're played it from D to D, which is the second note of the C major scale, that's the Dorian mode. Well, that's really hard to hear the differences between those if you're just to do it all in one key with the same parent major scale. If you were to go through all the modes like that, it's going to be hard to hear what's really going on because your ear wants to go back to that major scale. We're so accustomed to hearing the major scale that it's going to sound like it wants to resolve back to that C every time. But when you take it and just keep the same root and bring it into different keys, which keeping it parallel does that, you're going to be able to hear the differences between the modes a lot easier. So I recommend trying that. Play a C major scale from C to C, then play it from D to D, which is D Dorian. You're going to hear that that's hard to hear the differences between the two. It really sounds like it's just a C major scale still. But if you do what I'm going to show you in this lesson and just keep the same root and play through all the modes, you'll really be able to hear the differences between the modes. So we're just going to do all of these in G to start off with, which means they're all going to have a G root. And the only reason I'm doing it in G is because it falls in a nice place on the fretboard. So every one of these I'm going to show you is going to have a G root note, and then all these other intervals are just going to change to the new mode, which I'll explain as we go through. So you know that G Ionian is just a G major scale. It's root 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 back to root. And if you looked at the actual letter names, it would be G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and back to G. That's a G major scale. Now we're going to take this root of G and build the Dorian mode off of it. So we're not staying in the key of G. We're not starting on this A and building a Dorian note. We're going to build it from G. So if we do that, we end up with G Dorian, and now our intervals become root 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, back to root. Those are the intervals of the Dorian mode. And this G Dorian, its parent major scale is actually F now. So we've kept the same root as we started with, which is G, and we just built, starting on G, the Dorian mode. And then if we do it again, starting on G, and build the next mode, which is Phrygian, we get G Phrygian. Now your intervals are root, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, back to root, and its parent major scale is actually E flat. So again, we kept the same root, we just built the third mode this time, and all these intervals are based on the Phrygian mode, but keeping the G as our root note. Then we do it with the fourth mode of the major scale, which is Lydian. That means we're building a G Lydian. That gives us a root 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6, 7, back to root. G Lydian's parent major scale is actually D. Build the fifth mode of the major scale is Mixolydian. We're staying on G, so that's G Mixolydian. Mixolydian's intervals are root 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, back to root. G Mixolydian's parent major scale is C. And that's because if you're confused about the parent major scale, we're on the fifth mode of the major scale, meaning we're starting on the fifth note of some major scale to build this mode, and G is the fifth note of C. So that's how we know G Mixolydian's parent major scale is C. Just like if we were on Lydian, which is the fourth mode, it means we're building Lydian mode out of some major scale starting on the fourth note. G is the fourth note of D. So that's how we know G Lydian's parent major scale is D. And more on that as we go through if that's confusing to you. So the next mode is Aeolian. That's starting on the sixth note of the major scale. And since we're keeping it in G, that gives us a G Aeolian. And the intervals of Aeolian are root 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, back to root. G Aeolian's parent major scale is B flat. That's because G is the sixth note of B flat. That's how we know that G Aeolian's parent major scale is B flat. Then we're on the last mode, the seventh mode, because there's only 7 modes of the major scale. There's 7 notes in the major scale, which means there's 7 modes. That's Locrian. Since we're staying on G, it's G Locrian. Locrian's intervals are flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7, root. G Locrian's parent major scale is A flat because G is the 7th note of A flat. That's how we know that G Locrian's parent major scale is A flat. So then if we were to take all of those and put them into a diagram, every one starts with a G root. So all of these modes are starting on G. Building Ionian is just the major scale, so it's root 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, back to root. You already know that. Dorian is built root 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, back to root. So that's why you end up with a B flat and an F this time instead of a B and an F sharp when you build a G Dorian. Phrygian is built root, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, back to root. That's why you end up with the A flat, B flat, E flat, and F if you compare that to the actual major scale, because you flatted the 2, flatted the 3, flatted the 6, and flatted the 7. And so on. You can go through all the modes that way. That's how to look at the modes in parallel and how they all compare to each other. And really you're looking how they compare to the major scale, which is Ionian. For example, Locrian is built root, flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7. If we're comparing that to the actual major scale, which you know is just root 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that's why you end up with the A flat, B flat, D flat, E flat, and F, because up here you had A, B, D, E, and F sharp. You flat all those 1/2 step, that gives you Locrian right here. And then looking at this chart, we can see where all the parent major scales are. I've highlighted them in the lighter gray. So Ionian is obviously G, because it's just a G major scale. But then you can see that Dorian, G Dorian, the parent major scale is F, G Phrygian, the parent major scale is E flat, and so on. So technically this G Dorian scale is an F major scale, just starting on G and ending on G. This G Phrygian scale is actually just an E flat major scale starting on G and ending on G. You've just created G as the new tonal center instead of E flat, or for Dorian, G is the new tonal center instead of F. And we can look at it in C as well, because C is an easier key to look at since there's no sharps and flats in the major scale or the Ionian mode. Then you can go through and see which ones are sharped and flatted, because Dorian, you have an E flat and a B flat. Since there's no sharps and flats in the major scale, you know that the third and the seventh are flatted. Phrygian, you have a D flat, E flat, A flat, B flat. Since there's no sharps or flats in the major scale, the Ionian mode, you know that the 2, the 3, the 6, and the 7 have been flatted, and so on. Or another way to look at it is in order of brightness, and that makes it a little easier to visualize. So order of brightness just means that the brightest has a sharp, and then you go down through no sharps and then flats, and the flats make it darker. So for example, you'd start on Lydian. We're in the key of C, so we're looking at everything with the C root. So these are looking at C and parallel. Lydian is your brightest mode because it has one sharp and no flats. Ionian, you just flat this sharp to get the Ionian mode, and then you have no sharps and no flats, so it's just the major scale. So Lydian's brighter because it has a sharp, and then Ionian, the major scale, is a little darker because it doesn't have that sharp. Then Mixolydian is your next brightest, and that's just taking the Ionian mode and flatting the seventh. And that's why Mixolydian is a little darker than the Ionian mode and darker than the Lydian mode. And all three of these, you know, build major chords because you're building off the 1, the 4, and the 5, because Ionian's the 1, Lydian's the 4, Mixolydian's the 5. But Ionian's a little darker because it doesn't have that sharp 4. Mixolydian's a little darker because it has a flat 7 and no sharp 4. And then you just go through the order of all of them. The next darkest is Dorian, and that's because it's taking Mixolydian and flatting the 3, so it has a flat 3 and a flat 7. The next darkest is Aeolian, and that's taking Dorian and flatting the 6, so it has a flat 3, flat 6, and flat 7. Next darkest is Phrygian, that's taking Aeolian and flatting the 2nd, so you have a flat 2, flat 3, flat 6, and flat 7. And then your darkest by far is Locrian, and that is taking the Phrygian and flatting the 5th as well. So you have a flat 2, flat 3, flat 5, flat 6, and flat 7. So if you start on Lydian, to get to Ionian, you flat the 4. To get from Ionian to Mixolydian, you flat the 7. To get from Mixolydian to Dorian, you flat the 3. To get from Dorian to Aeolian, you flat the 6. To get from Aeolian to Phrygian, you flat the 2. To get from Phrygian to Locrian, you flat the 5. And that gives you the order of brightness. So again, if this is confusing, we're going to come back to it multiple times. It's just important to touch on it now before we really dive into each individual mode so that you can at least have an overall picture. And like I said, if it's not making sense now, it's something you'll come back to and eventually it will all make sense. So just keep going through these lessons and eventually, just like with music theory, it's all going to become clear and we're going to fill in all the gaps as we go. So in these upcoming lessons, I'm going to dive into each individual mode and talk about their qualities, and that's really going to help tie everything together, what we've been talking about. And by the time we're done with this section, I think it'll all make sense to you. So go ahead and move on to the next lesson where I'm going to dive into the Ionian mode. And be sure to download the e-guide. All these diagrams are in there. And be sure to subscribe because we had at least one new lesson every day.